So this is largely going to be an overview of the Phanerozoic, this period at the very end. I'm going to show you that stretched out in its full glory. And the Phanerozoic is the time for which the fossil record does a pretty good job of documenting the changes in animal form. Now there are three eras in the Phanerozoic. The Paleozoic, starting at around 542 million years ago at the close of the Precambrian, and ending at the Permian-Triassic boundary 252 million years ago. So that's a duration of 290 million years. The Mesozoic starts at 252 million years ago and ends at 65.5 million years ago at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. And the Cenozoic extends from 66.5 million years ago to the present. And I want to go through these three eras briefly, but twice. Once in the traditional animal-focused way, and then again in a plant-centric way, which we'll be developing more as we work our way through a survey of plant life in the upcoming videos. So the Paleozoic starts off with the Cambrian period, in which we have all different kinds of animal life flourishing and diversifying in the productive shallow seas. The first half of the Cambrian is particularly intriguing because of what seems like an incredibly rapid rate of diversification of animal form that's evident in the fossil record. We actually call this the Cambrian explosion, not because of a literal explosion, but rather because of the explosive diversification of animal life. Now, in the not too distant future, we're going to be talking about another explosive diversification, this time of flowering plants. So the idea that the fossil record shows us life suddenly going nuts is almost like a recurrent theme in evolution. In the Cambrian, we see the first fossils from most animal phyla. These species were kind of primitive at first, but they underwent a lot of diversification, evolving into many other forms, most of which have gone extinct, but some of which still exist in the array of modern animals. Now, with 290 million years, the Paleozoic is the longest of the Phanerozoic, and there are documented changes of ups and downs in the overall animal diversity. And over the long course of the Paleozoic, the animals that we see become more and more familiar, more similar to what we know today. And by the end of the Paleozoic, in the Permian period, we have fishes and amphibians and reptiles, but no mammals or birds. We also have insects and crustaceans and clams and squids. In other words, there are many familiar forms, but we also have forms that are totally different from anything we have today. One in particular is called a trilobite. And I want to show you a good picture of a trilobite because the picture I drew kind of sucks. So yeah, that's a trilobite. And trilobites were extremely abundant throughout the Paleozoic, but they never made it past the Permian. Now, the end of the Permian is also the end of the Paleozoic and the start of the Mesozoic, and the Permian-Triassic boundary is also called the Great Dying because we lose about 90 to 96% of all marine species, including the trilobites. And on land, there is also a high rate of species lost, although not nearly as bad as would happen in marine systems. Now, with marine animals, they were hit especially hard, with several higher taxonomic levels, like families and orders, getting completely wiped out. The taxonomic families and orders that weren't driven to total extinction were still hit hard because they still lost a lot of their genera and species. We'll come back to the causes of extinction a little bit later. But this idea of extinction, the total disappearance of animals like trilobites as well as thousands of other named species, is well documented for us because of the fossil record. Fossils were there, and then all of a sudden these fossil organisms were no longer there. And undoubtedly there are countless other animals whose bodies are not amenable to fossil preservation that we simply don't know about. And without question, many of these also went extinct at the Permian-Triassic. The Mesozoic era begins with the Triassic period, which is followed by two other periods, the Jurassic and the Cretaceous. And this is sometimes known, mostly in children's books, as the Age of the Dinosaurs. Though for a college student, some clarification is appropriate if not necessary. Now, I agree that dinosaurs have been awe-inspiring. Who doesn't see the terrifying lethal potential of a T-Rex? But look, dinosaurs weren't even around for most of the Triassic, so calling the Mesozoic era the Age of the Dinosaurs is only two-thirds correct at best. So here's a picture of a dinosaur. This is Allosaurus. Second, Age of the Dinosaurs really suggests that dinosaurs met their demise when the Mesozoic came to a close. But that isn't correct either. One group of dinosaurs, we call them birds, have flourished throughout the Cenozoic. You could say that we still sort of live in the age of the dinosaurs. Smallish, feathery, and sometimes delicious dinosaurs. And even if we were to accept all this and still wanted to find the whole era as belonging to these oversized protobirds, cruising on land for only 2/3 of the Mesozoic, this is still looking past all of the marine life. No dinosaurs lived in the oceans, and also ignoring both plant life and microbial life. Any one of these three would have been far, far more significant, dwarfing the dinosaurs in terms of both overall biomass as well as species diversity. Climatically, the Mesozoic was the warmest of the three Phanerozoic eras, and this is significant in accounting for the success of large-bodied animals, and yes, I'm talking about dinosaurs here, that were either ectothermic, cold-blooded, or only weakly able to regulate their body temperature. Mammals also got their start in the Triassic, although they were small and insignificant until the start of the Cenozoic. Now, in the seas and oceans, you had large reptilian predators, not dinosaurs, like plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs, as well as a large diversity of shelled cephalopods, similar to squids and octopuses, called ammonites. Here I am in a museum with a whole bunch of ammonites scattered throughout the entire room. And these are huge animals. These are huge shelled squids. And they are important predators of fishes and other marine invertebrates. Now these ammonites, the plesiosaurs, the ichthyosaurs, and of course all the non-bird dinosaurs, they all went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous, which is marked by perhaps the most exciting mass extinction event, which occurred at the boundary between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene. Now the third era of the Phanerozoic is the Cenozoic, starting with that Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction. And sometimes we talk about the first time in the Cenozoic as either the Paleogene or the Tertiary. And they don't mean the same thing, but I just want you to get used to hearing both Tertiary and Paleogene referring to the first time in the Cenozoic. Now, in the same way that we sometimes have dinosaurs being the featured taxon of the Mesozoic, mammals play a similar role for the Cenozoic. And the first tens of millions of years of the Paleogene showed another stunning diversification of all the main groups of placental mammals. Those are the mammals that are not marsupials or things like the duck-billed platypus. In case you're interested, humans and human culture have been around for only the past 30,000 years or so. And this is such an insignificant tick at the very end of the long history of life on Earth that we won't be spending any time talking about historical events within that period. Although what humans are doing today really does have an important impact on life and is relevant to many of the things we'll be talking about, especially in terms of the atmospheric chemistry. So now that you know the animal side of the story, let's talk about plants. Remember that we're defining the plant kingdom as only those things descending from the very first plants to come up onto dry land habitats, not algae. We can call them land plants even though many forms like water lilies have gone back to primarily aquatic lifestyle. But basically this is the definition of the kingdom Plantae. It might be something that you'll need to get used to. That when I say plants, I'm not including kelp or most types of seaweeds. They aren't descendants of the earliest land plants and are not part of the plant kingdom. The first invasion of dry land by plants probably occurred during the Ordovician, right here, which is the period coming right after the Cambrian. These first plants were non-vascular and scarcely more than algae, but with some adaptations that allowed them to persist in spite of having to dry out during brief periods of drought. This is something that the aquatic algae have never had to deal with. During the Silurian, and then continuing through the Devonian and the rest of the Paleozoic, plants just get better and better and better at living on dry land. They keep moving further and further inland and ultimately come to dominate the landscape. It's kind of like this. Few plants, few plants, few plants, 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 plants. Basically, they dominate the landscape and produce these immense coal forests stretching across whole continents towards the end of the Paleozoic. Now, in some ways, plants made things better for themselves. The activity of plants sped up the weathering of rock, and the deposition of organic material created something that we now know as soil. Plants invented soil, which basically made things a whole lot better for plants. Now they had something they could anchor in and draw nutrients from. And so this invasion of dry land by plants involved the production of soil, which is basically better for more plants, which took advantage of that soil, made even more soil, and so forth and so on, such that by the time we get to the Carboniferous period, still there in the Paleozoic, much of the Earth's continents at equatorial and temperate latitudes were just covered in forests of vascular plants. Plants that were mostly unlike anything that you would know today. None of your typical trees, but mostly gigantic, non-seed producing plants, kind of like ferns, but not really. Now, as these forests grew up, a vast amount of biomass was produced through the photosynthetic activity of all this plant life, and through the Carboniferous, we ended up with the production of massive coal deposits. Forests kept building, and we ended up having this enormous layer of coal stored away under the ground, and the effect of this was a profound drop in atmospheric CO2 at the same time as the Earth's oxygen levels rose to the highest levels ever. The rise of the Carboniferous forests corresponds to a protracted period of cooling and drying of worldwide climatic conditions, with a sort of reverse greenhouse effect. With less CO2 to trap heat energy radiating away from the Earth, things got a lot cooler. And because things were cooler, you had less evaporation off of the world's oceans, and therefore less overall precipitation. The plants of the Phanerozoic effected a massive change in global climate, kind of the opposite of what we're seeing today. In fact, one of the potential strategies we have for mitigating our current situation of adding so much CO2 into the atmosphere is to mimic this process of carbon burial through a variety of means. Google carbon sequestration if you want to learn more. So here's a question for you, to see if you've been paying attention. What would you expect to happen to the 13C content of atmospheric carbon dioxide during this period of organic carbon burial seen through the rise of the Carboniferous forests? Pause the video now to think about your answer, and start it again when you have your answer in your mind. If you said that atmospheric carbon would undergo a positive 13C excursion, that is to say, carbon-13 would become more abundant than 1.109% as a result of all this photosynthesis, removing so much of the carbon-12 from the atmosphere, that's the correct answer. You can see here that carbon-13 increases throughout the course of the Carboniferous, and that's exactly what you'd expect with such a long period of carbon burial. I said before that Carboniferous forests were made up almost entirely of plants that would be unfamiliar to us today. But by the Permian, all four major groups of gymnosperms, that is, pollen-producing seed plants, were established. These are plants we know of today, and they were already representing a major presence in Permian forests, while these non-seeding, spore-producing plants like those of the Carboniferous, they'd step back a bit, sharing the drier world of the Permian with the gymnosperms. And this brings us to the plant-based evidence for that truly awful time for life right there at the Permian-Triassic boundary. Now, we already know from the animal fossil record that at the end of the Permian, there was darn near a complete annihilation of marine animal life. Land plants also took a massive hit. The events that unfolded, however, were actually quite different for plants. And the story, that is the evidence, is given to us from a study of pollen and spores recovered from deep ocean cores taken from the ocean bottom. So you go out on a big boat, which is equipped with what amounts to an extremely long apple coring device that you drill into the ocean bottom, and you extract a really long plug of mud. In this tube of all the things that have settled out onto the ocean bottom over the past few 100 million years. Now, you won't be finding any T-Rexes doing this, but what these deep ocean cores lack in terms of large fossils is more than made up for by the high-resolution studies they allow on microfossils, marine microorganisms to be sure, but also pollen and spores from land-based plant life, what we call the palynological record. Here's that core of mud. It's been split in half and cut into shorter chunks. Now, when we looked at this mud, what we found was that at the Permian Triassic, there was a loss of gymnosperm pollen, lasting for a period of about 10,000 years. Things were certainly bad during that time for land plants, but not nearly as bad as it was for the marine organisms. These same ocean cores show a strong negative 13C excursion, lasting for 10 times longer, roughly 100,000 years compared to the 10,000 years in which we don't see gymnosperm pollen in land plants. Now, land plants by their nature may already have some distinct advantages in their ability to survive long periods of bad conditions. They have resistant stages like seeds and spores. They also potentially have access to microhabitats in which they might be sheltered from those harsh conditions. Neither of these are really there for animal life, especially animal life in the oceans, where a principal cause of the challenging times is coming from a decrease in oceanic pH. So plants may have all these advantages to begin with, and top it off with the fact that bad times for plants was 10 times less relative to what happened in the oceans. And it's no surprise that all of the major land plants known from the Permian survived. They're there even after the Permian-Triassic extinction, which killed off so many forms of marine life. The bottom line here is basically that this great dying at the end of the Permian was a jolt for plant life, to be sure, but not really a significant cause of extinction. After a relatively quick post-cataclysm recovery, the gymnosperm-dominated plant life continued to chug along right through the Triassic, the Jurassic, and through most of the Cretaceous, while those other non-seeding spore-producing plants like ferns and horsetails, they were also doing quite well, even though they never dominated the landscape again like they did during the Paleozoic. But then starting right around here, mid-Cretaceous, there's another group, the angiosperms, or flowering plants, that burst into the fossil record with an explosive diversification that's continued pretty much right on to the present time. Now, was there any effect at all at that Cretaceous Paleogene mass extinction, the one that killed off all the non-bird dinosaurs? Yes, there was. Flowering plant pollen, which was there in abundance during the Cretaceous, disappeared for a few years, and it was replaced by fern spores. We call it the fern spike. But the flowering plants quickly bounced back, and none of the major plant lineages were lost across this boundary, and in fact, many of them underwent their own explosive radiations in the early Cenozoic, giving rise to the spectacular diversity of angiosperms that we have today. Now the burning question about what caused these two mass extinction events. The Permian-Triassic event right there, and then the Cretaceous Paleogene event right there. And I want to start off by saying that we actually recognize 5 major mass extinctions within the Phanerozoic, as well as several minor ones. Now these two that we talk about are very significant in that they define the boundaries between the 3 eras of the Phanerozoic. We know that the end Permian event was the harshest event of all, but the second harshest event for life was not this one that occurred over here, even though the dinosaurs didn't like it. Okay? The second harshest mass extinction event is one that occurs at the end of the Ordovician, pretty early in the Paleozoic. The causes of this end Ordovician extinction are not as well understood as some of the others, but we do know that there was a fairly rapid period of glaciation and sea level drop. And with the sea level dropping very quickly, it's pretty easy to see how this would have been devastating for all the marine-based life that we had in the shallow seas of the Cambrian in the earliest Ordovician. It's also a little bit ironic, but also kind of sensible, that the sea level drop that we had at the end of the Ordovician was actually a catalyst for the successful invasion of land by the earliest plants. There's another mass extinction event near the middle of the Devonian, and another one at the end of the Triassic. And we call these the Big 5 mass extinction events of the Phanerozoic. There were lots of lesser extinctions, and I don't want you to forget about this guy over here. If you remember that the beginning of the Phanerozoic was also marked by a potentially huge major mass extinction, complete with its own 13C excursion, and this was the one that caused the extinction of the entire Ediacaran fauna. Now all these events, no matter what the size, and even the smaller events, they're documented for us by the permanent loss of taxa, extinction, from the animal fossil record. And one important message here is that bad things happen, and they happen with some regularity too. So we can talk about this event right here and this event right here, but don't take home the impression that these were in any way isolated incidents or even unusual events, especially when you can consider things on the time scale of the Earth's long history. So, in order to understand the Permian-Triassic event, you have to take into account 2 rather awful situations coinciding at about the same time, a very unfortunate time to be sure. The end of the Permian is associated with the coalescence of the continental plates into a massive supercontinent, Pangaea. And this would have removed large areas of coastline, and the interior of the continent would become very arid and also subject to huge daily temperature fluctuations. Meanwhile, there's strong evidence that the oceans went almost completely anoxic. That's lacking oxygen, really bad for life, right? at a time very close to the end of the Permian, and this might also have been related to the configuration of the continents and the way that this would have affected the ocean circulation. But there's another smoking gun for this greatest dying of all time, and this is the intense volcanic activity occurring in a large igneous province known as the Siberian Traps. Literally millions and millions of cubic kilometers of lava pushed their way up and out of the Earth's crust over a huge area. The Siberian Traps, or hills, are just a relatively small part of this large area of volcanic flood basalts, which covers an area about the size of Europe. Now, in Permo-Triassic Siberia, there was a particularly lethal double or maybe even triple whammy of conditions that increased the amount of resulting death by a large factor. What I want you to understand is that these massive flood basalts, or large igneous provinces, are pretty frequent occurrences over the Earth's history, both on land and on the ocean floor, and they don't usually cause extinctions like what we saw at the end of the Permian. I mean, it's never good when all this magma starts pushing its way upward. Eventually rising to the Earth's surface, there's a lot of outgassing that occurs. Carbon dioxide and other potentially harmful gases are released into the atmosphere, and that's bad news. But what made the Siberian igneous province especially devastating was not the volume of magma itself, but rather the stuff that the magma had to pass through in order to reach the surface. Magma is incredibly hot, and as it burns and pushes its way up to the top, it has to pass through the local rock. Now in the process, the local rock is going to undergo contact metamorphosis, which is going to entail a lot of chemical reactions, the nature of which is going to vary according to the composition of that local rock. Now this stretch of primeval Siberia happened to be a particularly unfortunate assembly of carbonates, Cambrian salts, evaporites, and also massive quantities of coal. Maybe you can see where I'm going with this. The carbonates would contribute carbon dioxide as well as other kinds of organics. The salts would combine with those organics to produce halogenated hydrocarbons, which would have depleted the ozone shield. The coal simply burned for the thousands of years of volcanic eruption. And so with an event of that size and duration, and with magma flowing through these lethal materials, it's easy, though horrifying, to understand the tremendous die-off that had to have occurred during that period. Now, the Cretaceous-Paleogene event is also associated with two potential smoking guns, and one of these is the Deccan Traps, another large igneous province that created the huge flood basalt on the Indian continent as it was moving across the Tethys Ocean. As you can see in this, another one of Christopher Scottise's animations, India starts off from a location adjacent to Madagascar, and right here, bam, you can see the flows of lava as the Indian Craton moved over this hotspot right at 65 million years ago. Now India continues to move up very quickly to its present home, which of course is smashed up right against Asia, and it actually continues to smash into Asia even today. In comparison with the Siberian Traps, however, the volume of magma in the Deccan Traps is smaller, and the local rock was far less inclined to be triggered into producing massive quantities of greenhouse gases and toxins. Still, given the timing of this eruption, it could not have been good for life, and we think it was likely a contributor, though not the main cause, of the die-off that we see at the end of the Cretaceous. The other smoking gun for the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event was the impact of a bolide, a large meteorite that was roughly 10 to 15 kilometers in diameter. There's an enormous crater, the Chicxulub crater, right at the tip of the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, and it formed as a result of a bolide impact 65.5 million years ago, that is, coinciding perfectly with the boundary between the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic. Given the heat produced during such an impact, it's entirely likely that contact metamorphosis of the local rock would have released a sudden pulse of gas that would have combined with the effects of the Deccan eruptions, resulting in another enormously challenging time to be alive on the planet Earth. This, again, is supported by a detailed palynological record from deep ocean cores, telling the story of the Cretaceous-Paleogene event from the plant's point of view. The pollen of flowering plants would have been abundant right through this area here, but it disappeared right at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, giving us the famous fern spike, a period of thousands of years where you see fern spores but not a whole lot of pollen. But then, all the major groups of plants came back in the early Paleogene, and some of them actually underwent their own enormously successful radiations after this fern spike. It's almost like they were triggered into huge diversifications by this period of massive destruction. So actually, if you were to take a plant-centric approach to this history of life, you might look at these major events at the end of the Permian, at the end of the Cretaceous, as being clearly challenging, but I might venture to guess that you wouldn't even call them extinction events at all. Plants simply did not undergo the same loss of higher taxonomic diversity that animals did during these events, and this is actually a pretty important thing to note as we discuss the evolutionary history of plants. In this video, we basically went through the eras of the Phanerozoic twice, once with a traditional animal-centric view, and then again with an eye on the plants. We also addressed the significance and causes of the two era-defining mass extinction events. In our next few discussions of plants' progress in invading the dryland habitats, we'll be making frequent reference to the 6 periods of the Paleozoic, thinking about the landmark events in plant evolution and also the paleoecological context in which they arose.